Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week I'm really excited to welcome onto the podcast Leslie Sponsel. Les, thank you so much for making time for us.
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about spiritual ecology.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things to talk about, and your work in that area has been really inspirational for me and for so many people. And for folks who might not be aware of you, which I'm guessing is a small group in this, for anybody who's listening or watching this podcast, you're professor emeritus in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Hawaii, and you've done a lot of research and teaching around the world. You're a pioneer in developing a few interdisciplinary research areas: spiritual ecology, ethical anthropology, ethnoprimatology. The interdisciplinary scope of your work I find particularly inspiring. You've written numerous journal articles, book chapters, encyclopedia articles, monographs, edited books. And so people tuning into the podcast might be familiar with your highly acclaimed book, Spiritual Ecology, A Quiet Revolution, which anybody watching might see just above my shoulder. Wonderful book. I've used it a lot for teaching when I teach classes on that subject. Um,
Great.
one of the things I always like to hear from people is just how did you get into this work? Especially you got into thinking about the intersection of spirituality and ecology at a time where it wasn't at all common. And so, no, those are often really partitioned very far apart from one another. So,
Yeah.
what was your way into that study?
Well, have you heard of Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Graham? They organized a series of conferences at Harvard University, which was the beginning of the Forum on Religion and Ecology. And I was so fortunate to go to three of those. I wish could have gone to all of them, but at any rate, that really was the catalyst. And then a second thing is that I was hired at the university here, University of Hawaii, to develop and direct the ecological anthropology program. And that was in 1981. And for decades, I taught basic courses on ecological anthro and environmental anthro and so forth. And gradually, I began to realize that secular approaches to environmental problems, and more recently, climate change, are crucial. They're indispensable, absolutely. And they made a lot of progress, but they're not sufficient. They're not enough. And I began to realize that religion and spirituality may help turn things around for the better. They're not some magical solution, but I think they can be tremendously powerful. And my book was subtitled "A Quiet Revolution, Nonviolent Revolution," and it's really happening. And it's not just spiritual ecology, it's religion ecology with the Forum on Religion and Ecology and all of the wonderful work that you are doing and others with the Living Earth community, and Bron Taylor with Dark Green Religion and so forth and so on. Uh, it's it's all over the place. It's growing exponentially. I looked at Google for spiritual ecology and related subjects back in, I think, 2003 or so, and then again more recently, and the counts of results indicate that this is growing exponentially. And that's very promising, very hopeful, very positive. So those are the two main factors that led me to get involved with spiritual ecology. And then for some reason, and I don't know why, I should have found out, I was approached by Greenwood Press to publish a book on spiritual ecology. And for better or for worse, I said, okay. And it was quite an undertaking. And eventually the Greenwood Press was then, the book was published with Prager
Right.
books, and then that's been taken over by Bloomsbury Press. So anyway, the book is out since 2012, and I did a lot of background research for that religiously for years and years. And I decided to take a historical approach. And so a lot of the book is about really icons in this whole field, even beginning with the Buddha and St. Francis of Assisi, and so on, right up to recent times. There's a chapter on supernovas, which includes a discussion of Tucker and Grimm and Taylor and Gottlieb and some others. And supernova, there I used it in a positive sense, referring to explosion of creativity and energy. And that's really what's been happening. And I cannot, I cannot give more credit. I cannot say more about the achievements of people like Tucker, Grimm, and Taylor. I suspect they may have been cloned in order to accomplish all of this. There's
Right.
just such a tremendous amount of material that they're dealing with in various ways and involving other people as well. Even E.O. Wilson
Right.
was involved in one of the final conferences out of Harvard, and he published this book, Creation. And he's a hardcore scientist, I believe an atheist by his own admission, but he really felt that religion and science need to work together. Uh, they have a common cause in the case of environmental problems.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful movement when even the scientists and the atheists are saying this is what we need right now.
Yes,
They're like, I
yes,
don't believe in
indeed.
any of this, but we need it really bad.
Yes, yes, yes.
Well,
Well, and there's also a myth that scientists, or to be a scientist, you need to be an atheist or at least an agnostic.
right,
And actually, they're scientists, they may not affiliate with a religious organization, but they are often spiritual by virtue of their work in nature,
yeah,
uh, which is a catalyst spirituality for many people. Donald Crosby, Jerome Stone, and others edited a book called Handbook of Religious Naturalism
right,
with Rutledge. And they're atheists and agnostics, but at the same time, um, they even use the word religious. So it seems like a contradiction, religious naturalism. And another one I talk about in my book is Alistair McGrath,
ah,
who's
right,
a Christian theologian. He has two doctorates. One, I think it's molecular biology, and the other one in theology from no less than Oxford University. And he's trying to find common ground and, in a sense, revitalize in a new way natural theology.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that whole dichotomy between natural and supernatural. They're like, no,
Yes.
you don't need to have the supernatural to be
Yes.
religious and to have that kind
Yeah.
of spiritual commitment to
Yes.
the universe, to nature. Yeah, that's really promising work, I think, because I think that's one of the things that people are very allergic to when they hear religion or spirituality. Like, oh, you're asking me to believe in something supernatural. Like maybe in some cases, but not in all.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's one of the axioms of spiritual ecology is it's not promoting any single religion. It's not saying this is the truth, this is the way, all else is uh, whatever. And it's saying if you're religious or if you're spiritual, then look into that
Right,
in relation to the environment and ecology and climate change. And what can you do? What if you're religious, your sacred texts in your faith, what do those have to say about the environment and so on? Uh, and I wanted to recommend highly, as well as for the Forum on Religion and Ecology, its website, I wanted to recommend the book Faith for Earth, A Call for Action, which was by the UN and the Parliament of the World's Religions. And actually, Faith for Earth is available. You can search on Google and you can download the book. And it's a wonderful compilation of very brief, concise, informative uh, descriptions for various religions of the world. Not all, but many of the main ones. And then the last third or so of the book is a pretty good overview of the environmental crisis and climate. It's
Right.
a
I appreciate
wonderful
you mentioning that.
resource.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's
I
free online to download.
Yeah, I wish more books were open access like that. And yeah, I really appreciate that. I'm actually using that in the course I'm teaching right now on it's called Religion and the Environment, but I frame
Oh,
it more in
great.
terms of religion and ecology. And yeah, love the Faith for Earth
Yeah,
initiative, and it's such a handy text, especially because it's
yeah,
relatively short.
yeah.
Sometimes people hear here's like a 500-page book that'll summarize the field. That's a
Yeah,
little much
yeah.
for the average person.
And Tucker and Grimm were involved with that too.
Yeah, it seems like they're involved in a little bit of everything. Any project related to this, you kind of
Yeah,
scratch the surface and you're like, "Up,
yeah,
there they are. They had
yeah.
their hand in it a little bit." Like your point that they might have been cloned. Like no, like single people cannot produce this much. You must be like several people.
It's awesome. It's remarkable.
Yeah, and it's really a testament to how energizing a spiritual or religious perspective can be. And then it gives people this tremendous energy to do this work and to be so committed to it. And that's exactly what we need if we're going to address severe environmental problems of our time.
Hmm. I might say parenthetically or incidentally that spiritual ecology is one of the courses I teach, and I teach several others, including War and Peace,
Mm,
which isn't so positive and hopeful. But spiritual ecology, uh, it attracts the largest enrollment. And the students that come into that course, it's optional, it's not required, are really interested and enthusiastic, and they're involved in one way or another in the subject already. And so, again, it energizes people. It's very positive and hopeful, and it's a joy to teach, and for the students as well. And incidentally, out in Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific, many people are surfers.
mm.
And I used to think surfing was just sport, entertainment, or whatever. But actually, when I've talked to a number of surfers, and in my course, also students are surfers, some of them, um, they say it's spiritual.
Mm.
It's a spiritual experience being in the ocean and feeling the unity and the wonder and the awe and so forth, power, energy of the waves and so on.
Right. Yeah, I remember that's one of the things that Bron Taylor talks about in
Yeah.
Dark Green Religion is his
Yes,
own
he's a
surfing
surfer
practice.
himself.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
he's like, "Oh, I know for myself and for the surfing community, this is religion, even though
yeah.
it's not one of the kind of institutionalized religions we normally think
Yes,
of."
yes, yes,
And then the way that some surfers then start organizations like Surfrider and other things like that, where they're trying to protect the ocean because it's
yes,
the
yes,
spiritual connection to it, and that
yeah,
brings about this ethical commitment.
yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Personally, never even tried surfing. It seems very difficult. And most of my life I haven't lived anywhere near the ocean, so it
Yeah,
wasn't a
yeah,
practical activity
yeah.
to engage
Well,
with.
I'm originally from Indianapolis, Indiana, which is in the middle of cornfields and no ocean nearby. And so I'm not a water person, but I do appreciate surfing and the ocean and so on.
Yeah.
Incidentally, spiritual, please cut me off or whatever if I'm diverging, but spiritual ecology, as I view it, really includes three components.
Mm,
One is intellectual, the other one is emotional, and then the other one, third, is practical. And the intellectual is really science and scholarship, and the emotional is really spirituality and spiritual experiences. and then the practical is action and advocacy. And
Nice.
often they all go together sort of in synergy, but sometimes an individual is just focused on one or the other or two, sometimes all three.
Right. I like that kind of like the intellectual, emotional, and practical. It's kind of like the head, the heart, and the hand.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, that's great.
Yeah. I know
Uh,
there's a line from Patriarch Bartholomew where he says, sometimes it is a long journey from the head to the heart to the hand. Because I know that's the case when some people study these things intellectually. It doesn't always seep into the emotional part. And even when they have the emotional part, it doesn't always translate to practical outcomes. But that's the work, I think. So yeah, I think that's a good way to frame the kind of scope of spiritual ecology.
and he uses the heart, hand, and so on.
Yeah, that's a line from him.
Oh,
So I'm
oh,
technically stealing his line.
I'd love to get the citation. Yeah,
Oh yeah, I'll have
yeah.
to send you that after we're done today.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good one, and I know you talk about him in the book as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great. I mean, one of the things I really like about your perspective is precisely that spiritual ecology is such a broad umbrella, because you'll talk about people like Patriarch Bartholomew or John Muir, Wangari Maathai, but also like James Cameron,
The
and
Avatar film
yeah,
series. Yeah.
and then and
And I
Burning
think he's a,
Man.
I think he's a spiritual ecologist in his own way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think so. And I wonder, one of the things that strikes me, and because there's things like, the field of religion ecology, and Braun Taylor says religion and nature. You're talking about spiritual ecology. Other people talk about ecological spirituality. And so one of the struggles I always have is how are we supposed to sort out this great diversity? And everybody's using slightly different terms for things. And do the terms not really matter? Or like, how are we going to categorize it? Because
Yeah.
especially as you mentioned, there is this Living Earth Community project that's based on a book that Mary Evelyn and John and I co-edited a few years ago, but we're turning this into a
Wonderful book.
broader website. Oh,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, really a privilege to be part of that. And now we're turning that into a website. And so one of those things is how do we categorize these things when we were casting such a wide net? What are the terms we use? What are the categories? How do you sort through this?
Yeah. The Living Earth Community is the book which can be downloaded free online
Right.
as well. And your initiative for a website is fantastic. And the two components, differential
Right,
spirit
differentiated sentience and then
sentience,
ecological
yes, and
spirituality. Yeah,
yes, those are wonderful. And um, and it's opening up a whole new world, the differential sentience, that which science is now waking up to that.
yeah,
And it has so much potential. You know, sorting through these terms. As an ecologist and evolutionist, I view diversity as the basis of evolution, adaptation, and survival.
right.
And so likewise in the case of spiritual ecology and all of these other terms, I applaud that diversity, and I don't say that spiritual ecology is better than anything else among the many terms. Um, it is a matter of preference and focus.
Hmm.
And I think that's about all it is. And there's so much overlap as well.
Right.
Yeah. And they reinforce one another. I think it's kind of synergy.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I know sometimes in academia, people can be a little territorial about
Yes.
things, and you don't really feel that synergy. You feel the competition a lot more than the collaboration side of things.
Which is unfortunate. And I think some of that is a product of American culture.
Hmm.
Uh,
How so?
the individuality, the
Hmm.
individualism, the competition. So many sports are win lose and so forth,
Right.
and and elections and so on and so forth. And I don't think I think it's really misplaced. That besides competition, there's cooperation,
Yeah.
collaboration, and so forth, which is what you folks are doing, and spiritual ecology is all about. It's not competition.
Right. Yeah. All perspectives are welcome. We
Yeah.
don't have to decide who the winner is and who the loser
Yeah,
is.
yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I feel like that's something that people who aren't looking at this from an academic lens totally understand. And then it's really in like academia where you get a lot of these fights about the terminology and
Yeah,
who's
yeah.
really like the father of the field and those kind of arguments.
Yes,
But on
yes.
the ground, people are like, look, I call it whatever you want, but this
Or
is
wait a minute, there's a mother of the field.
yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, so it's funny these terminologies like the father of this or that, or even languages like being a pioneer of something. I'm like, ooh,
Also,
that's
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, we can say one of the pioneers or one of the early contributors. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Early contributors. That's
yeah,
a nice way to
yeah.
put it.
It's nice to be recognized, but sometimes ego gets carried away.
Yeah, right. That's very true. Even for the littlest things, ego
Yeah,
comes in and it's like,
yeah,
oh, I'm getting acclaim. I'm
yeah,
important.
yeah,
And,
yeah.
and then it really also misses the fact that even a great contributor had other influences that were helping them do the work that they were
Oh,
doing.
yes, yes. We all
Yeah.
have mothers and fathers and other influences in our lives. Yeah.
Yeah. It's always a team effort.
And one of the interesting things is when Mary Evelyn and John Grimm started at Yale, they were in, I think it's called the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies.
Right.
And yet their whole background is in history, comparative world religions. But the head of the school at the time, I think it was Gustav Speth,
Right.
he saw the relevance, and they were hired, and they had a joint appointment also in the school, divinity school, and religions there. So, and I forget when that started, but it must have been early 2000 or so.
Yeah, I think it was around 2007, maybe around
Yeah,
then. Yeah.
yeah. But that in itself was a major recognition that science and religion can be mutually relevant and helpful.
Yeah, especially knowing that joint appointments are complicated in the first place. To have a
Oh,
joint
yes.
appointment between religion and then
Yeah.
forestry and environmental studies at an institution like Yale is a
Yeah.
really big signal that the tide is turning.
Yeah. But what you point to about academic territoriality, even departments, separate departments, and the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities, and so forth, all these boundaries and divisions are often counterproductive.
Yeah.
And I've often thought, for example, even here at the University of Hawaii, the university should have maybe a yearly theme to unite people, or even longer, a 5 year or even indefinite period
Mhm.
focused on climate change.
Oh, right.
Global climate change is an existential threat in so many ways, and we're already seeing it. And that would dissolve to some degree a lot of these academic boundaries if there could be more collaboration, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary.
Right. I like that idea a lot, especially something like climate change. There's not a single field of study that doesn't have something to contribute to that.
Yes,
Wherever you're at in a university,
yes,
climate is definitely relevant to what you're
yeah,
doing.
yeah, yeah.
I wonder, you mentioned, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. I wonder if you could say more about that distinction, because I feel like it's not, I mean, people are so in their disciplinary silos, they're barely talking about interdisciplinarity, not to mention transdisciplinarity. So I wonder if you could talk about that distinction. I find it very interesting.
Well, um, interdisciplinary, like, for example, my recent research, well, for the last decade or two, has been in Thailand on sacred caves.
Right.
And that integrates my initial background in geology with my background in anthropology and with my interest in ecology and religion. They're all coming together. And that's sort of interdisciplinary, and it's also transdisciplinary. It's beyond a single discipline. And it took me decades to see sacred caves as the focus that could again the word synergy that could pull all of this together.
Yeah,
And
that's
there is
so
something
interesting.
called geoanthropology,
Hmm.
which is looking at the relationship between geology and anthropology.
Oh.
And there are animal studies or zooanthropology. There are a lot of hybrids or interdisciplinary areas. Um, I think in terms of multidisciplinary, um, I don't know who you may think of someone. I don't know who would be an exemplar of that offhand. In some ways, Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, because the Forum on Religion Ecology really includes so much. It's another umbrella.
Yeah.
You know.
I wonder if you could say more about your research with the sacred caves in Thailand and this kind of the kind of Buddhist ecology and environmentalism. I find that really fascinating.
Well, this is another catalyst for the development of my interest in spiritual ecology.
Hmm.
And that is my wife is Thai, a philosopher by training, and a Buddhist
Hmm.
through from childhood. And I first started going to Thailand around the mid 1980s, and um, in Thailand, almost every house and major buildings, even post offices and banks and gas stations,
Hmm.
have a spirit house,
Hmm.
which sort of honors the spirit of the land locally. And some of these are very elaborate, some of them are much more modest. And often daily, there's some offering to the spirit of the land, placing food, water, a can of Coke or something like that, or incense or flowers, whatever. And this is all over Thailand. It's not just Thailand. There's a belief in Southeast Asia and elsewhere about the spirit of the local place. And then there are sacred caves. There are caves all over Thailand, but mostly in the western part. And many are just secular, but many also, and I forget the figure, I think it's around 1,000 or so, or at least several hundred sacred caves. And they are marked by the presence often of shrines, Buddhist images, monks who reside there and meditate there, and lay people who also go often to meditate in these caves. And when I started going to Thailand, I also saw sacred trees,
Hmm.
and often they are wrapped with colorful cloth.
Hmm.
Um, and even I could identify a sacred tree because it had this colorful cloth, unmistakable. And so I really began to realize that Thai people traditionally are spiritual ecologists.
Hmm.
And in many ways, sacred caves and sacred trees, sacred forests, sacred mountains, and so forth and so on, are concrete manifestations of spiritual ecology. And the locus of that spirituality, that sacredness, may be inherent in the place
Hmm.
and also in humans that visit the place. And one of the interesting things is, for example, here in Hawaii, there are a number of mountains, including Mauna Kea, which is sacred on the Big Island. And people go to those places as visitors, as pilgrims, Native Hawaiians, but many people of different religious backgrounds. And they sense something very extraordinary about the place and sometimes have some kind of epiphany or spiritual experience or whatever, the wonder, the awe of the
Hmm.
volcano on the Big Island, which is really Earth being born with the
Right.
lava flows and so on. So people from very different backgrounds, religions, cultures, languages, etc., ethnicities, often see the same place as sacred. They and they may identify it quite explicitly as sacred. And that to me suggests there's something manifest in that place. Spiritual ecology manifests in that place itself. That's the locus of the
Right.
sacredness, although the locus of sacredness can also be in the human individual, or it can be in some non-human being as well, which is what your living earth community is exploring and documenting.
Right, yeah, that the sacred can be found basically everywhere. And then it's
Yes,
just a question of how it shows up and then the different ways it gets interpreted. Because you'll have a Christian, a Buddhist, an indigenous person, they're all seeing the same place and they all feel it's sacred, but then
yeah,
they're going to define that in slightly different ways.
yes. Although there are also, for example, in Thailand, um, people may identify with Buddhism as their principal religion, but a lot of the public also has elements of Hinduism
Hmm.
and animism in their religion. And people of Chinese background who are Thai may also have Taoism and Confucianism elements in their religious beliefs, values, worldview, etc.
Yeah, I
So
really
it's not
appreciate that.
necessarily a single religion, although it can be as well, certainly.
Right, since some religions really are kind of exclusive about
Yes,
the way they
territorial.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Like you have to pick a side. You're either
Yeah,
with us or
yeah.
against us.
You
And
know,
then
in that, excuse me, in that book, Faith for Earth, on
right.
page 71, there's a list of commonalities among religions in terms of what I call spiritual ecology. And those commonalities are extremely important, and they're platforms for collaboration.
Right, yeah. I feel like overall religions have a lot more in common than they do different.
Yeah, like people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and especially some really basic things like it's good to share, treat others the way you want to be treated, the golden rule. Like these things, they're pretty universal, really.
Oh, yes, which is one of Karen Armstrong's points in
Right.
her, I think, what is it, Compassion website. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's another good example of a scholar that eventually turned to thinking of the connection between religion and nature.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And her recent book, Sacred Nature.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so
Uh,
that was nice to see because she's done such amazing work. And then she's like,
oh,
oh, I got to
yes.
have one book that definitely addresses
Yeah.
nature. So, yeah, it's another good example of what you're saying, like the exponential growth of this field. More and more
Yes.
people keep contributing.
If you go search on Google for whatever religion and ecology or sacred places or sacred nature, spiritual ecology, etc., or on Amazon.com, it's unbelievable how much there is.
Yeah.
Uh, there's and it's growing again. I think exponentially.
Yeah, I think so too. That's definitely my sense of it. And so much of it really did start exploding, like you were saying, the supernova of Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, those conferences at Harvard in the
Yes,
90s,
yes.
really, and of course it has a much longer history, but after those conferences, it's just been exploding.
Also, there's so much on YouTube as well. If you
Right.
search for these, and of course now spotlights out of the Foray website. That's a great series. I made a note to integrate some of those talks in my next course syllabus.
Oh, nice. That's great to hear. Yeah, I've had my students occasionally tune into an episode, but it feels weird to promote my own podcast to my own students. For some reason, that feels weird to me.
Oh,
Uh,
I think it's appropriate.
yeah, and it really is the case. And one of the reasons that we have this podcast at all is because the younger generation, millennials, Gen Z, they're getting a lot of their information from these kind of media. I think next on our list is the Forum on Religion Ecology will be launching a TikTok account, and we'll start trying to get our information out that way. Speaking of like the different media, we're trying to get things out on a podcast, open access books like Faith for Earth or Living Earth Community, and TikTok, Instagram, whatever it is. There's so many different media. That seems like one of the challenges of spiritual ecology in the future is communicating across a lot of different platforms, more media. I wonder what other things do you think we should be working on to get the word out more? Because obviously it's growing exponentially, but we need even more energy. Because as great
Um,
as things are going with spiritual ecology or the field of religion ecology or whatever you want to call it, we still are on track this year to have more carbon emissions globally than we had any other year. And we keep breaking that record every single year. So it's like things are getting better,
yeah,
but things are still getting worse. And so, like, what are the
yes.
challenges to really try to make more of a difference, whether it's in terms of intellectual or the emotional or the practical? What are some of the challenges you're seeing?
Well, often academics and scientists, they speak to each other and they speak to the choir, the
Right,
true believers within their domain, whatever it is. And much more needs to be done speaking to the general audience. Popular books without academies, without all the technical stuff, all the footnotes and so forth, bibliography,
right,
but just general books for the public. But another thing is, you go to a doctor or dentist's office, and often they have a rack of magazines, and inevitably, it's usually Time Magazine um, and National Geographic and so on. And I think if there could be some articles, interviews, whatever, on those kinds of public sources, that might help. And then the other thing is, and maybe the most powerful, and for me the most hopeful, is the young generations, like climate activists, the Sunrise Movement,
right.
even Extinction Rebellion, and also Greta Thunberg. I don't know if she's religious or spiritual. I've read that in some of the things in her statements are available on YouTube. She says science is my religion,
Hmm.
but she may also have something deeper in terms of connections with nature and spirituality. But at any rate, um, youth activism who are concerned about their future
Yeah.
and should well be. And so should everybody else be concerned about future generations and the young, the world they're facing with global climate change, which is accelerating and inescapable, inevitable. Doesn't matter whether there are deniers or not. It's there. It's obvious if you follow the news media at all in terms of extreme weather events, which are increasing in frequency, in intensity, in scale, and in the cost, uh, economic costs, ecological costs, human suffering, deaths, etc. Um, and I see global climate change as possibly another catalyst in this quiet revolution.
Hmm.
I think people often, when they're faced with dying or disease or some horrible tragedy, uh, they turn to religion. And I think that's going to happen more and more with global climate change.
Hmm.
There are going to be a lot of negative things going on too, of course, conflicts, wars, refugees, and so forth. But I think the youth movement, to me, is the main thing to articulate with that spiritual ecology and also foray and so forth to somehow plug into that. And TikTok may be one avenue for that as well. Um, getting on PBS,
Hmm.
public television. I don't know what percentage of Americans look at PBS, but it
Right.
probably has quite a substantial amount. And on the evening news, and of course online in various places there as well.
Right. Yeah, pretty much any avenue you can reach out to, we should be reaching out.
And the UN, I
Right.
mean, this is Faith for Earth is UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, as well as the Parliament of World.
Hmm.
Unimaginable. Um, and it has had successes. And the current, uh, what is he called, Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, um, he's very concerned about climate change and has been making a number of statements. And of course, there are the UN conferences on hope and so forth on climate change. And I think plugging into that is another avenue, which is global.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like we
And
need action at all levels.
also the Earth Charter
Right.
to somehow articulate with that and foray and so forth.
Yeah. No, the Earth Charter is a really impressive document. And
Yeah.
that's one of those things, if everybody was reading that and living up to that, we would be
Oh,
solving a lot of problems.
uh, that incidentally is also, I think, one of the Achilles heels, maybe the biggest one for religion and ecology, spiritual ecology, etc. And that is the discrepancy between ideals and actions.
Right.
And if, I don't think religion ever caused any problems. I think
Hmm.
it's people who manipulate, who abuse religion that cause those problems in the name of that religion or whatever. And I think if more people lived up to the ideals in the religions, sacred texts, and so forth, we'd be a lot better off. I mean, the
Yeah.
golden rule, it's so simple, so common
Yeah.
sense, effective.
Yeah, no, that's a great example, and it seems to me one of the biggest misconceptions I see from people who are very critical of religion, and there's a lot to be critical of, but there's
Oh,
this
yeah.
often this idea that religion causes a lot of wars. I'm like, no, no,
Yes.
no. It's people causing these wars for a variety of reasons, and then they use religion to justify it.
But does science and technology and industry and business also cause wars?
Right. Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, war is a big business.
Yeah.
The arms industry, the weapons industry, and what's happening with Gaza and what's happening with Ukraine now. A lot of money is being made,
Yeah.
and it's in the interest of some of these businesses for the wars to continue.
Yeah. It's a horrible
And,
thing to
and
think.
when can we recognize that peace may be more profitable?
Yeah, right. How do we get that industry going? The peace industry, making lots of
Uh,
money through peace.
uh, And incidentally, one plug, there's something called the Center for Global Non-Killing,
Hmm.
which was started by a colleague here in political science, Glenn Page, Center for Global Non-Killing. And their website has books on this subject, which you can download free. And so that's another thing to consider in terms of spiritual ecology, and that is what is our relationship with war
Yeah.
and with peace. Um,
Yeah, I think that's a serious question, especially with organizations like Extinction Rebellion that
yeah.
are kind of willing to be a little aggressive and
Oh yes,
violent
yes. I
and
don't
verging on,
condone all of their actions, but I
yeah,
can sympathize. I can understand what they're doing, why. Yeah.
yeah. It's a question I
But
really
it's
like
their
to ask
future.
people.
It's
Yeah,
their future, and it's the future of other species. And again, your living Earth community and the differential sentience that is opening up, I think, another revolution.
right. Once people realize how much intelligence and agency there is throughout the natural world, that's really going to change our perspective on who we are as a species and what our purpose here is on this planet.
Yeah. As an anecdote, I'll try to make this quick. I have a colleague in Thailand who's a primatologist, and she initially started out uh, with genetics, and she was doing an experiment with silkworms. And she would open up the container and put some food in, and they would come up to have the food. But eventually, she started taking some of them out of the container for her experiments. And soon, when she opened up the container, they would start to retreat. And there's sentience there. And these are silkworms.
That's a
Um,
great example.
and I'm sorry, but um, I don't like tree trimming.
Right.
I don't like clear cut logging. There's been a lot of research done. I think it's Suzanne Simard
Right.
and others on how trees communicate via their root networks and fungi and so forth and chemicals and signal one another when they're being attacked. And I can't imagine what they're communicating when they're trimmed,
Yeah.
or moreover, when there's clear cut logging of old growth forests. And some of those trees are centuries or even older.
Yeah.
And they have knowledge and wisdom in their own way and so forth. And, it's so horrible.
Yeah. And this research that's coming out, I think will help people wake up to how horrible that is. Like, oh, trees aren't just natural resources at all.
Yeah.
There's so
Yeah.
much more.
There's a wonderful statement by Thomas Berry in his book Evening Thoughts. I think it's on page 17, which is most profound, elemental, and perennial, pivotal. And that is the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects.
Right.
Uh, and I think if people realize that more and activated on that, engage with that idea, that would help as well. And also Teilhard Desjardins, which again, Mary Ellen Tuckler and John Grimm are involved in the Teilhard Foundation. And he was a profound influence on Thomas Berry, and
Mhm.
Thomas Berry, in turn, on Mary Ellen Tucker and John Grimm, among many others. And if I can recall it, Teilhard, and I've never been able to pin down a citation for this, but I've seen it here and there, and I like to quote it. And he said something like, humans are not having a spiritual experience, humans are spirits having a human experience.
That's
And
good.
again, that's another very profound statement.
Yeah. He's a good one. And another good example of somebody for whom religion and science weren't separate because he was a Jesuit, but
Yeah.
also a paleontologist.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, I've appreciated Pope Francis, also a Jesuit, has said some favorable things about him
Yeah.
as well. He's like, yeah, that guy's pretty good. We might want to pay attention to him.
More so, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think that might be a really beautiful note to end on. We're living in a
Okay.
communion of subjects, not a collection of objects, and we're spirits having a human experience.
Yeah.
That's especially I like that it's hopeful and optimistic. Sometimes in a podcast or when I'm teaching, I just get more and more pessimistic and then end on a really sad note of like good luck with mass extinction. Like let's
Oh,
let's end on a positive note.
yeah.
But Les, thank you so much. This was
Well,
really
thank you
really
so
a
much.
pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
And yeah, we'll have to do it again sometime.
Okay.
It was because there's just so much more to talk about. I mean, even just all of your anthropological work and things like that. We didn't get to talk about the Yanomami people. There's
Oh, that's
so many other
oh,
things.
just well, I'll end it there. I won't get into that.
Yeah,
But they are
exactly.
also spiritual ecologists.
Yeah, exactly. And it's
Okay.
something I just so appreciate about your work is how planetary your perspective is, being in Latin America, Asia, North America, just everywhere, and so interdisciplinary. such a broad, encompassing scope, and it's just so capacious and welcoming and inviting. And I think that's really the best that spiritual ecology can be.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Well, thanks,
Thanks
and
for the
thanks.
opportunity.
Oh yeah, geez, my pleasure, and thanks to everybody tuning in.
Thank you, folks.
Yeah, and hopefully everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. And
Okay.
we'll be back with some more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.
Aloha.
Aloha.